Berlin, April 1945. The city smolders. The Third Reich collapses, and Hitler is announced dead. The war appears over, but in the shadows, another battle begins. The Allies sweep through ruined factories and laboratories, not seeking gold or land, but rather knowledge. Rockets capable of reaching the edge of space, chemical weapons that could wipe out populations, and the minds behind them. Every file seized, every scientist interrogated, could tip the balance of the coming Cold War. In the aftermath, thousands of Nazi documents were confiscated, countless weapons destroyed, and war criminals put on trial at Nuremberg. Yet not everyone faced justice. Some of the men who had served Hitler, complicit in all the Third Reich is known for, were quietly escorted across the Atlantic. They were given new homes, new jobs, and in some cases, even medals. Their crimes buried, erased, sanitized under a single bureaucratic tool, a paperclip. This is Operation Paperclip. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. In 1944, as the Third Reich collapsed, Allied intelligence uncovered something terrifying. Germany had built weapons and technologies that shouldn't have existed in the 1940s. Rockets that soared into the edge of space. Jet planes faster than anything the Allies could field. Chemicals like sarin gas, a nerve agent so deadly it could kill with a single drop. Even experimental bombs designed to harness nuclear fission. How had the Nazis leapt so far ahead? The answer was as chilling as the inventions themselves. The Nazi state poured vast resources into science. Universities were emptied, research institutes militarized, industries seized. Scientists were forced into service, and all ethics were stripped away. Human beings, millions of prisoners, slaves, and camp inmates, became expendable material for experiments. Dachau prisoners were frozen in ice water to test pilot survival. At Ravensbrück, women were deliberately infected with gangrene or had their bones broken to test new drugs. At Auschwitz, slave laborers toiled under conditions designed to kill, while IG Farben used them as guinea pigs in chemical warfare. Nazi science advanced so quickly not because it was brilliant, but because it was ruthless. Inhuman suffering was the price of progress. The Allies realized that if they didn't seize this knowledge, the Soviets would, and did. So, missions were launched into the dying Reich to capture the research, the documents, and the scientists themselves. The first of these was Operation Alsos. It began in 1943 as a hunt for the Nazi atomic bomb program. Allied intelligence feared Hitler might be close to building a weapon that could level a city. American and British teams swept across Europe, grabbing everything they could find. They raided laboratories, nuclear test sites, and chemical plants. They captured uranium stockpiles, and even kidnapped German physicists for interrogation, including members of Werner Heisenberg's atomic team. Alsos was about intelligence gathering, the ABCs of war: atomic, biological, and chemical warfare. The Nazis hadn't come close to an atomic bomb. Hitler had viewed atomic science as Jewish science. What Alsos did uncover was just as alarming: an empire of advanced research stretching across rocketry, aviation, and chemical warfare. Soon Alsos wasn't enough. The Americans realized that gathering documents was one thing. Possessing the men who created them was another. Thus was born Operation Overcast. The original plan was simple: round up the leading German scientists, bring them to Allied camps for questioning, and keep them out of Soviet hands. After all, the war wasn't over, and Germany's scientific elite were still a strategic threat. But as interrogations piled up, something shifted. U.S. officials realized these men weren't just prisoners of war. They were assets, weapons in the coming Cold War. At first, it was temporary, a way to study them before deciding their fate. However, with the continued discovery, Overcast evolved into Operation Paperclip. No longer just a temporary program of detainment, it became a full-scale recruitment operation, an extraction pipeline. German scientists, including committed Nazis, war criminals, and men implicated in atrocities, would be brought to the United States. Their files would be scrubbed, their pasts rewritten. A simple paperclip attached to their dossiers would mark them as cleared, even if their crimes would have damned them at Nuremberg. Approximately 1,600 Nazi scientists and engineers were brought to the United States, many with blood on their hands. These men would decide the balance of the Cold War. Alsos had gathered intelligence. Overcast had gathered men. But Paperclip gathered the power. The Soviets were doing the same. In October 1946, the Red Army launched Operation Osavayakim, a mass roundup of German specialists. In a single night, they kidnapped more than 2,000 scientists, engineers, and their families, shipping them to the Soviet Union at gunpoint. But the Americans had already taken the prize. The biggest names, the best rocket men, the ones who would go on to define the space age. And this is where the moral compromise of Operation Paperclip begins to show. Because the men chosen weren't innocent scientists trapped by circumstance. Many were deeply complicit in Nazi crimes. So how did it work? The name Paperclip came from the simplest of tools. When dossiers on Nazi scientists landed on American desks, those marked with a paperclip were the ones to be spared from scrutiny. The clip meant ignore the past, overlook the crimes, move this one forward. In many cases, files were actively sanitized, erasing evidence of war crimes, SS membership, or involvement in slave labor and human experimentation. Men who should have faced justice at Nuremberg instead received visas, new identities, and employment in U.S. programs. The scientists were brought to America under tight secrecy, often on military transport. Some were initially hidden at Camp Overcast in Bavaria, interrogated and assessed, then shipped to bases in Texas, Alabama, and Ohio. Their families were later relocated, creating entire German enclaves in the American heartland. Once in place, they were integrated into U.S. projects, working on rockets at White Sands and Huntsville, developing chemical and biological programs, or conducting aerospace medicine at Air Force facilities. It was an open secret in Washington. The State Department objected, highlighting that many of these men were guilty of war crimes. The Justice Department protested. Even President Truman initially ordered that no active Nazis should be brought over. But the paperclips erased the evidence, and the scientists kept coming. The contrast between the American and Soviet efforts was stark. Both powers sought the same prize: German scientific knowledge and talent. Yet their approaches were fundamentally different. The Soviets, through Operation Osavayakim, relied on force. Entire towns were uprooted overnight. Scientists, engineers, and their families were moved at gunpoint into the USSR. While this secured numbers, it created resentment, fear, and inefficiency. The Soviet program lacked one key element: public acceptance. The USSR made no effort to hide the fact that these men were former Nazis, and their coerced relocation bred resentment. Scientists were under tight control, with little freedom to innovate, slowing progress despite vast numbers. Many scientists were unmotivated, cut off from familiar labs, and had no autonomy. Projects ground slowly because supervision was militarized, and cultural and language barriers hindered collaboration. The Americans, by contrast, treated the scientists as assets to be integrated. But integration required more than resources. It required deception. The U.S. government lied to its own population, sanitizing files, suppressing evidence of crimes, and portraying the scientists as innocent experts. The U.S. created an environment where the men were not only safe, but socially and professionally integrated. The public accepted them. They were granted jobs, new homes, and in some cases, honors. Freedom, prestige, and the promise of a new life motivated the scientists to fully contribute to U.S. programs, from rocketry to aerospace medicine. In short, the Soviets were honest but coercive. Their scientists were resented and constrained. The Americans were deceptive but incentivizing. Their scientists were accepted, empowered, and productive. That difference shaped the post-war technological landscape and gave the United States a decisive head start in the space race. Their brilliance was repurposed for American technological dominance. Operation Paperclip wasn't just about anonymous men in lab coats. It brought over some of the Reich's most notorious figures, like Werner von Braun. He was the visionary behind Germany's V-2 rocket program, the world's first long-range guided missile. The rockets themselves were technical marvels, but the Mittelwerk facility where they were produced was a human death trap. Carved into the Constein Mountain, these underground tunnels housed tens of thousands of forced laborers, Jews, political prisoners, and POWs, who worked in freezing, cramped, and dangerous conditions. Starvation, disease, and brutal beatings were routine. Von Braun visited the tunnels, inspected the rockets, and oversaw production schedules, fully aware that thousands were dying to meet deadlines. After the war, von Braun was brought to the U.S., where he became the father of the American space program, designing the Saturn V rocket that carried astronauts to the moon, while his wartime atrocities were largely ignored. Another was Arthur Rudolph. Rudolph was von Braun's deputy and the operations manager of Mittelwerk. He ran the assembly lines with brutal efficiency, where mistakes were punished with public hangings, sometimes targeting the 5 slowest Jewish prisoners in a work detail as a warning to others. Rudolph was obsessed with production quotas, directly overseeing an operation where tens of thousands died under forced labor conditions. Despite evidence of his complicity, he was brought to America under Paperclip, where he managed the Saturn V rocket program. He received the NASA Distinguished Service Medal before his past was exposed in the 1980s, forcing him to renounce his U.S. citizenship and quietly leave the country. Then there was Otto Ambros, a chemist for IG Farben. Otto Ambros played a pivotal role in Nazi chemical and synthetic industries. He helped develop sarin gas, a nerve agent designed for mass killing, and supervised the Buna Monowitz plant at Auschwitz, where prisoners were forced to manufacture synthetic rubber under inhumane conditions. Thousands died from overwork, starvation, and abuse. Ambros was convicted at the Nuremberg trials for war crimes and crimes against humanity, but served only a few years before being released. Later, he consulted for the U.S. Department of Energy, applying his expertise in chemical and industrial processes despite his history of complicity in mass murder. Dr. Walter Schreiber. Schreiber, Surgeon General of the Third Reich, was involved in Nazi medical experimentation, including freezing tests and deliberate infections at Ravensbrück and other camps. Prisoners suffered permanent injury or death in experiments designed to test human limits for military and aviation medicine. Brought to the U.S. under Paperclip, he initially worked in military medicine, but fled to Argentina when journalists exposed his past. His story illustrates how America selectively shielded scientists while erasing their complicity from official records. Hubertus Strughold. Known as the father of space medicine, Strughold developed studies that helped astronauts survive in extreme conditions. But in Nazi Germany, he oversaw human experiments, including placing prisoners in low-pressure chambers, freezing experiments, and high-altitude tests that led to multiple deaths. After the war, he moved to the U.S., working for the Air Force and receiving widespread honors. Only decades later were his Nazi-era experiments publicly revealed, tarnishing his legacy. These were not neutral scientists. These were men whose hands were stained with blood. Yet, in Paperclip, they were rebranded as pioneers, their crimes hidden behind a single clipped-on document. On paper, Operation Paperclip was a success. America's rocket program left ahead. Werner von Braun's rockets launched men into space, and Arthur Rudolph's Saturn V carried astronauts to the moon. U.S. advances in aviation, medicine, and even chemical weapons bore the fingerprints of men who had once served Hitler. The Cold War became a battle not just of ideology, but of stolen Nazi science. But at what cost? Men who oversaw death camps, who signed off on human experiments, who treated life as expendable, were rewarded with careers, honors, and even medals. Victims, the tens of thousands who died in tunnels, camps, and laboratories, were erased, while perpetrators were celebrated. War criminals were rebranded as visionaries, their crimes hidden under bureaucratic secrecy. It raises a haunting question: can scientific progress ever be separated from the crimes that created it? Was putting a man on the moon worth sanitizing the record of men who had built rockets on the corpses of slaves? Operation Paperclip remains one of the starkest examples of moral compromise in modern history. A story of victory built on silence, science built on suffering. Operation Paperclip is a reminder that history isn't clean. When we look at the moon landings, we see triumph, humanity reaching for the stars. But in the shadows of that triumph are the ghosts of Dora, Auschwitz, and Ravensbrück. Every launch, every breakthrough, carries with it the silent weight of those who never lived to see it. Operation Paperclip gave America the future, but it buried the past. And that's the story we still wrestle with today, whether the pursuit of power and progress can ever justify making a deal with the devil. This was Phantom Frontiers. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, please drop a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And like and subscribe for more true stories from the edge of the unknown. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your mind even more so.